The barn was burning. Masked riders were gone, and Colt staggered from the smoke, bleeding, silent, cornered by truth. When Abigail demanded to know who he really was, he didn't flinch. He just looked at her and confessed 5 words that changed everything. But what happened next will shock even those who thought they'd seen everything. But first, let's go back to the beginning. The silence that followed settled heavy as ash. Abigail stood frozen, her gloved fingers tightening around the brass clasp of her case. The murmur in the saloon, cards shuffling, boots scuffing, glasses clinking, faltered like a flame starved of air. The barkeep didn't blink. Behind him, rows of cloudy bottles gleamed under lamplight, their labels peeling like old secrets. His jaw, dusted in stubble, tightened. She swallowed. I received letters from him. He asked me to come. Then he lied, the barkeep said flatly, and turned away to polish a glass already clean. A flicker of panic flared in her chest. She turned on her heel and walked out, the bat-wing doors swinging wide in her wake. The street outside had emptied with the setting sun. Dust coiled in the wind, turning the air into a muted storm of grit and rust. Her boots struck the wooden walkway with hollow finality. There was no hotel, no waiting carriage, just one lantern swinging outside a boarded-up telegraph office, casting long, slanted shadows. She walked. Nowhere to go, but forward was easier than standing still. A dog growled somewhere behind a fence. A child laughed in the distance, the sound too clean, too innocent for a town like this. She passed houses with curtains drawn and windows fogged from inside. Dry Hollow, she realized, was not just dusty. It was quiet in a way that whispered danger. A town with secrets buried shallow and tempers packed tight. At the edge of the main road, she found a bench outside a general store, long since closed. She sat, her legs trembling under the weight of dust and disappointment. The letter peeked from her satchel, creased, yellowed, written in a looping hand that had once felt like a promise. Her thumb brushed the paper. I ain't much, Miss Cross, but I reckon I know how to make a woman feel safe. It had sounded real, honest. And wasn't that what she wanted more than anything? Not comfort, not wealth, just safety, respect, a corner of the world to call her own. But now the name Thomas Langley was a wound the whole town flinched at. She blinked hard, swallowing back tears. If she cried now, she feared she wouldn't stop. So she watched the lantern swing, watched the wind tangle itself in the branches overhead, and she waited for a sign, a voice, or perhaps the courage to move again. The fire cracked, but it couldn't warm her. Abigail sat hunched in the corner of the bunkhouse, knees pulled to her chest, her dress wrinkled from days of wear. Shadows from the flames danced across the walls, long, wraith-like shapes that reminded her too much of the town's whispers. She hadn't spoken in hours, not since Colt had told her the truth in that level, emotionless voice of his. The truth had weight, not like a blow, but like sinking. Her fingers shook as she unfolded the letter once more, the one that had led her here. The loops and slants of Thomas Langley's penmanship had once felt like a strong hand guiding her through storm. Now it read like a ghost speaking from a lie. The same hand that wrote verses about honesty and second chances had once fired bullets into rival homes. The same voice that called her dear heart had been feared by a town still watching its corners. Abigail didn't sob. She cried the way the tired cry, silent, breathless, as if trying not to disturb the air itself. Each tear left a clean trail on her dust-smudged face. The chair creaked when she finally stood. It was the rocking chair Colt had built, plain pine smoothed by hand, carved with no flourish. Just strength. A chair made not to impress, but to endure. She lowered herself into it with the careful grace of someone unsure the world could hold her anymore. She rocked slowly, the motion rhythmic, anchoring. Each backward tilt felt like remembering, each forward sway like forgetting. The room smelled of cedar and ash. Wind tapped the window pane with ghostly fingers. In the stillness, she heard Colt outside, chopping wood in the dark. Not for her, perhaps, but for someone. It struck her that he never asked her why she'd come, never offered comfort, never probed. He simply gave space and structure, offered dignity without naming it. The contrast between men unsettled her more than the truth itself. Thomas had spun promises out of air. Colt offered nothing, and somehow gave more. She looked at her suitcase, still sitting in the corner. Unopened. A silent monument to a life she thought she was walking into. Now, all that remained was the memory of a voice, the echo of a name, and a hollow too wide to fill with anger. Not yet. That would come later. For now, all she could do was rock, and breathe, and begin the long work of surviving. The barn was still smoldering when the last embers surrendered to ash. Smoke hung thick in the air, clinging to Abigail's dress, her hair, her throat. The night wind carried it down the hillside like a ghost refusing to settle. She stood just beyond the scorched threshold, hands blackened from hauling buckets, lungs raw from shouting into flame. Her heart still thundered like hooves on hard ground. Inside the bunkhouse, Colt sat shirtless on a wooden stool, chest streaked with soot, a long gash curving down his right side like a punishment written in flesh. The lantern light was low, casting his features in half shadow, part man, part something else. Not a monster, not a hero, just the shape of someone who had lived too long with the weight of memory. Abigail's fingers worked with care, dabbing at his wound with cloth soaked in carbolic. She didn't speak. Not yet. Neither did he. His body flinched once, then stilled. The silence between them was heavier than pain. "You should have told me," she finally said, her voice not angry but exhausted. "I was trying to be someone else," Colt said. "Someone quieter. Someone useful." She looked at him. "You were trying to disappear." He didn't argue. The needle in her hand shook only slightly as she drew it through the skin. She'd sewn before, dresses, hems, even saddle straps. But this was different. This was mending the past in the most literal sense. His blood stained her sleeve, dark and sticky. It made the truth feel more permanent. "When did it start?" she asked. He breathed out, slow. "After the last man died." "Because of you?" "Because of who I used to be." She nodded, lips pressed tight. "Thomas Langley." He winced, not from the stitch, but from the name itself. "I buried him," he said. "But Dry Hollow never forgets." "And those letters?" Her hand froze mid-stitch. He reached into a drawer and pulled out a bundle, faded envelopes tied with string, edges curled from being read too often. He placed them on the table like offerings at a grave. "I read them at night," he said, "when I forgot what it felt like to be human." Her breath caught. There was no defense in his tone, no plea for absolution. Just a man sitting in front of the firelight, letting the truth live at last outside his skin. "You were never supposed to come," he added. "But when you did..." He looked at her, not begging, not breaking, just there. "I didn't think I deserved you." Abigail looked at the letters, then back at the man whose past had burned down around him. The needle resumed its path. She didn't forgive him. Not yet. But she didn't leave. The morning of Sunday service arrived brittle and bright, with the kind of wind that carried dust but not threat. Abigail stood in front of the cracked mirror, smoothing down the sleeves of her plain blue dress. There was nothing grand about her appearance, no lace, no brooch, no borrowed beauty, but her spine was straight, and her eyes held the calm defiance of someone who had weathered more than just storms. She tied her hair back with a strip of linen Colt had cut from the old barn curtain and stepped outside. Colt was waiting beneath the cottonwood tree, face freshly shaven, hat pressed to his chest. When she approached, he didn't offer his arm. He waited for her to take it. She did. The walk into town was quiet, but not tense. Windows twitched with movement, curtains parted by hands curious and unsure. No one called out. No one welcomed them. The air was thick with things unsaid. At the chapel door, Colt paused, but Abigail moved forward. Her heels clicked on the wooden floor as if challenging it to groan. They took their seats in the third row, close enough to be seen, far enough not to impose. Heads turned. Whispers stirred. The congregation, used to silence and judgment, found themselves face to face with something less familiar, unwavering dignity. The pastor didn't pause when he saw them. He simply nodded, emotion so small only Abigail caught it. She reached for Colt's hand and took it in hers. His fingers were rough, nicked from rebuilding what the fire had stolen, but they stilled against hers like stone finding river. After service, a woman from the bakery approached. Abigail braced, but instead of spite, the woman offered a pie wrapped in cloth. "For the week ahead," she said, avoiding Colt's gaze. "He once brought me flour when I had nothing." By week's end, the blacksmith left a bucket of nails on their porch. Mallory tipped his hat in the fields. Mrs. Henley sent over a box of sewing thread. The town, slow as thawing ice, began to remember not the outlaw Colt had been, but the man they had quietly depended on without realizing. And when the church bells rang 6 weeks later, Abigail wore the same blue dress. The chapel was full, but quiet. No music, no grand procession. Just two people walking toward each other, not to forget the past, but to carry it differently. When the vows were said, no one clapped, but the silence was reverent, not cold. The sheriff tipped his hat. The barkeep nodded once, stiff but sincere. Outside, the wind was still. For the first time, Dry Hollow stood still too, not out of fear but out of respect.